Today we're going to take a look at the SiteConnect software, which is software that is used to both configure and to collect reports from the iTouch tank gauge. When launching SiteConnect, the first screen that opens up will ask you to log in using a username and a password. The default username is main user, all one word with a capital M. The default password is 123456, and then to open the application you click your icon on the key icon. That will open up the main application. Should you desire to change the login or add a login, you can go to the Tools menu and User Manager. In that menu you can change the username and password. You can add other users and passwords and assign them access rights of either full access or view-only access. In order to begin with a connection or to begin configuring an iTouch tank gauge, the first thing you must do is create a site profile for the software to use. The way that you do that is you go to the File menu and select New Site Profile. Once you select New Site Profile, you can put in the basic connection information that you need for the tank gauge. A quirk of the software, though, demands that in the site telephone number field you enter in a number that is according to the format of the example given. So generally I just use that format, which is 0 1 2 3 4 dash 1 1 2 2 3 3. If you are going to use an IP connection to the tank gauge, you can then put in the IP address in the IP address box. In this case, I'll be using one of our internal tank gauges to show you the programming and reporting. You can also put in a contact and comments, but that is not required. And then click OK. It'll ask you to save that profile. So you give that profile a name, and then it shows you the directory structure that it will save this profile on this computer. All your profiles would be saved in the same location. You could then create individual profiles for individual tank gauges and be able to store the tank gauge configuration on your computer. So by doing this, I have now opened up the test profile, and to make a connection to the tank gauge, then I would then go to the controller menu, connect, and connect via TCP/IP. You could choose direct connect if you have a serial cable going directly to the tank gauge, or via modem if you're dialing up to a modem in the tank gauge. When you select the TCP/IP connection, it shows you what the programmed IP address is. If you wish to change that, you can then change that there and then click OK. The software will then look on the network to see if it can find that address and a gauge that belongs to that address that responds. It has found a gauge. It returns back the electronic serial number that belongs to that gauge. You click OK. It tells us that we're now connected. It tells us the controller version, any protocols that are currently assigned in the unit, the software versions that are in the unit. Click OK, and we are now connected to the gauge. Once we're connected to the gauge, all the menus in the top become available. If you notice, when you're not connected, many of those are grayed out and you cannot use them. However, the software does give you the capability of going to help and unlock menus if you're not connected to allow you to use some of those menus for practice purposes or for learning. When configuring the tank gauge, the first thing that you want to do is go under configuration and the product reference table. The product reference table is where you would enter names for the different products that are going to be stored in the tanks that are connected to this tank gauge. So in this case, we have some products that are pre-programmed in this tank gauge for us, and we can select from these when we get into the programming. To program the tanks and probes in the system, we would go to IS module setup. This is the intrinsic safety barriers that are located in the tank gauge that our external devices will be connected to. It opens a screen that shows us a picture of the available devices that we can program into the unit, and it shows you blank squares for module positions, module barrier positions that we can then connect these devices to. The way that we would assign a device to a barrier position is to simply take your mouse, left click, grab the device, drag it down, and drop it into the barrier position. So in this instance, I'm going to put a tank on module position 1 of the first module and a sump sensor onto position 2. Once you've done that, you can then double click on that device and it will open up a programming screen for that probe or that sensor. If I double click on device 1, the tank probe, it then opens up tank configuration for the probe at barrier position 1. At this time, I can give this tank a name. You must give this a tank number. This would be tank 1. If the tank is going to be manifolded to additional tanks, you would assign it to a manifold group. You would then select a product to assign to the tank, and this would be a product from that pre-programmed product reference table. If you are using a density sensor on the probe, you would then checkmark DMS, put in the factor A and factor B entries for that sensor. The density API screen would be either the density or the API number for the product that's in the tank. In this case, we'll put in 34 for diesel. Our reference temperature for net volume measurement would be 60 degrees Fahrenheit. You would select hydrometer, yes or no, if you're using a hydrometer in the tank. Select a tank shape. When you select a tank shape, you are given cylinder round end, cylinder dished end, cylinder flat end, rectangular, and vertical. If you select cylinder flat end, rectangular, or vertical, the unit will then pre-program tank charts depending upon the parameters for the tank size that you select. If you choose cylinder round end, which would be a fiberglass reinforced tank, then you will be able to enter in a tank chart or tank corrections at a later point. So in this instance, I'm going to select cylinder flat end. Delivery timer, you would set, this is the amount of time after delivery stops that the gauge will wait until it declares a delivery. Always show net volumes, yes or no. The gauge will indicate net volumes all the way down to a product covering the last RTD or the lowest RTD in the probe shaft. If you select no to always show net volume, when the product goes below the last RTD, your net volumes will then drop to 0. If you select yes, always show net volumes, it will use the temperature of the lowest RTD, whether it's immersed in product or not, to then declare what a net volume measurement would be. On tank diameter, you would select the diameter of the tank, and then you would select the nominal tank volume of the tank. When you select the nominal tank volume, then the gauge will assign a safe working capacity for that volume. The software will automatically insert a 3.1 inch product float offset for the product float. This can be modified after you actually stick the tank and get readings to measure to what the probe says as opposed to what the stick says. You can also do a water float offset and a lift off offset. Those become active when you select water float use, either not used, error disabled, or error enabled. What that means is we either don't have a water float, Or we do have a water float, but we want the probe to remain functional if for some reason we cannot read that water float, or we want the probe to give us an error and not read if we lose connection with that water float. So error disabled would disable the probe on a water float. Error enabled would keep the probe working if we have a water float issue. Time leak test settings. You could select the type of test you want: automatic test or a manual test. Automatic test, the system is always trying to test the tank. Running a static test only, so the tank has to be idle for the entire test. Manual test allows you to program a test time at a later point. The minimum product level for a valid leak test defaults to 50%. Depending upon the software that's in your unit, you may be able to set that to a lower level. Once you have that programmed in, you click Apply. The software will double check your entries to see if they are acceptable. Then it will then write the values to the controller. And then go back to normal operation. If you desire to make changes to the tank chart, you can then open up the tank correction table. And on the tank correction table, you can put in corrections for each height or each measure of height, whether that be inches or centimeters or millimeters, depending on what the units of measure are set for the unit. As you notice, we can set in, if I keep going up here, a grand total of 405 points in the tank that we can do this. So you set in the level and the gallons for those points. Once that is done, you can go to tank thresholds, and at tank thresholds, this is where you can set by either a volume or a height what your product and water limits will be for the individual alarms. So you have a water high, high, product low, product low, product high, high. So these can be set as either a height or as a volume. And on your delivery start, you could put in your delivery threshold start. So in this instance, it defaults to 50 US gallons per minute. Once we see an increase of that amount, we'll declare a delivery has started. Under More, this opens up another short screen. It says you are advised not to change these values. These are for using temperature alarms in the tank and the tank reference temperature if you want to change that. Again, we click OK. It checks the values. If we go OK here again, it brings us back to the IS module setup. We can now double click on the sensor. Once we double click on the sensor, it opens up the sensor threshold settings and programming. We could say the sensor is installed. We can give the sensor a name. We can assign it to either a tank, a pump, or a general site. If we assign it to a tank, here we've assigned it to tank number 1. If we wanted to put this underneath a dispenser pan, we could assign it to a pump, and you could put in the pump number. You see over on the right where you could set an upper threshold and a lower threshold. This will default to the normal threshold settings for the type of sensor that you have connected. If you need to adjust those, you can then do that. In this example, where our upper limit is 5.0 volts, our lower limit is 2.5 volts. Now, if I click apply here, oops, second number of 0 not allowed, where am I at? Oh, sensor number 1, and apply. It will then write that to the gauge. It's successfully configured. So now if I click the refresh button, it will then tell me what my sensor is reading currently. This device number 2 is a normally closed sensor, so when that sensor is normally closed, my voltage reading coming back is 5 volts. The way the thresholds work is if the voltage that we read is above 5 volts or below 2.5 volts, then we will go into alarm. So in normal operation, when this sensor opens, then our voltage would go down to 0 volts. When it goes down to 0 volts, we would go into alarm. When it's closed, we are reading 5 volts. If our power supply was putting out a little bit higher voltage than 5 volts, say 5.1 volts, in a normal condition, we would go into alarm. So what you want to do is you want to look at your threshold limits and then see what the sensor is reading in its non-alarm state, and then you can adjust those accordingly. Once your devices are programmed, then you can go under configuration and into your alarm setup. Once you enter the alarm setup screens, this is where you can actually set up alarm actions. So the first screen that you see, the first tab is System. So then we can generate alarms for power failures, for an input contact that we're watching for, a printer failure. So you just check the boxes to what you want it to do: audible alarm, visual alarm, to print the alarm, to activate output contacts, or print on event end. For the individual devices, the tanks, we can select what alarms we want to monitor in the tanks and what actions we want those alarms to take, whether they be audible, visual, printed, an output contact, print on event end, to send a fax via telephone, to send an email, or to activate an output module if optional output modules are connected. When you look at the sump sensor alarm action screen, you'll see that most of those are grayed out, and we just use the activated sensor line on the bottom to determine what actions we want to take. iTouch port parameters. Under configuration, these are what you would set if you were going to make a direct connection or a modem connection to the tank gauge. Under configuration, TCP, IP, and email configuration. This is where you would put in a IP address for your unit if you want to do that. So you would select a static if you want it to remain static, DHCP if you wanted to pick up an IP automatically from the network, and to set up your email server. You see this SMTP email server. You could set those settings in there. You'd have to get those from your IT personnel would be able to give you that information to allow you to send emails. Controller LCD display volume. On the unit, you can set to whether you want it to show net corrected volume, gross volume, or weight. Your density is in different kilograms per cubic meters. Under controller, you can retrieve the current iTouch configuration, or you can restore iTouch configuration if you open a profile from an already programmed tank gauge. So if I go to retrieve here, I click retrieve, and then I go proceed. The software will then pull all the programming from the tank gauge. It's currently successfully received. So if I go to configuration, I can go to IS module. Whatever was then programmed in the gauge would show up here, and all its settings. If I go to controller, I can set the date and time. I can do my global timed leak testing. So this is where we say what leak rate, what recurrence pattern. This recurrence pattern indicates how often we're going to store the tank tests, how long we want the tank tests to last, and what warning period that we want to be programmed in the unit to let us know if we have not passed the tank test. So you see here, when we're set for weekly, our leak test warning is set for 6 days, so a week is 7 days, so if after 6 days we have not passed the test, it would give us a warning that we have not passed the test. Under controller, You can also set a daily inventory report time so that the unit would then generate an automatic output or storage of the inventory. You could print the report by unchecking that. It would print it to the local printer. Otherwise, you set in a time and then you would be able to retrieve that. Also under controller this is where we would generate our reports. So under reports we can go to current inventory. We can look at the current inventory in the tank. It tells us a couple of other things besides the current inventory. It gives us an icon picture. It also gives us details. So it tells us what the volume is, what the temperature is, what the water is, the height is. It also tells us what our version numbers are in the unit, what our address is, our IP address. It also tells us by check marks or red lines what options are present in the unit itself. You can print the inventory by just pressing the print button would then print to the locally connected printer to the tank gauge, or if you do select printer and select the print button, it will then allow you to select a printer off of your computer or your network to allow you to print that out to another printer. There we go. So then what it does is it shows up the printers that are currently on your network and allows you to select which one you want to print to. You can also retrieve reports on delivery history, sensor status, and again sensor status can then be printed out. You can retrieve reports on warnings in progress, alarm history, tank strapping table, leak test results, diagnostic reports, and shift reports. Under tools, the SiteConnect software can be used to upload new operating software for the tank gauge using the hardware flash update and the bootloader update, and it will also allow you to upload new options to the tank gauge by using the update iTouch controller options. So these three menus selections will allow you to update the software to the unit without having to make physical hardware changes to the unit. The hardware flash update, bootloader update you would use if you are going from an early version of the iTouch software to a later version wherein the bootloader may have changed over time. You would then load the bootloader first, then do the hardware flash update. You can set your POS protocol. If you have the POS option turned on, you can select up to 2 different POS protocols and 2 different ports if you want to use them both simultaneously. We give you the list to select from, TLS 250, 350, and on down for the other selections. Also, under Tools, you can set a POS Secure Code if you want to use Secure Code for your POS communications. You can perform a remote cold start of the tank gauge. You can select on your printer from the tank gauge if you want the header to be a graphic or a text. You have User Manager, I showed you earlier, and you also have Contact Manager. And under Contact Manager, this is where you can set up address book entries for those that you would want to receive faxes or emails. Using the Email Manager, you would select that. You would put in a name and an email address and add them to the contact list so that when you select an alarm action that's going to result in an email, once you select the email button, we go to Alarm Setup, we go to Tank Gauge Setup, and let's say on a product low, we want to send an email. Once we select that email button, it allows us to select a contact from the email list, put it in the box and select OK. So now when a product low alarm occurs, the unit will send an email to that person that you selected. To remove that, you can simply uncheck that or delete that contact from that list and then OK. And that removes it from the email. You have icons below the menus, so if you look at the icons, the file folder is to open up an existing profile. The floppy disk icon is a carryover but allows you to save. The network icon is to allow you to make a connection. A modem icon for our telephone icon to make a modem connection. a TCP/IP icon to make a connection. The grayed out would be to break a connection, and a tools icon. Under localization, if this is being used in an international application, you can then set your date format, your time format, your decimal notation, the units of measurement, and the language that you want the software to use. So when you're all finished, you can either click the X in the application to close it, or go to File and Exit. Once you've closed it, of course, it would then rely on the username and password to reopen and to open up an existing site profile if you want to use that site profile. So as I'm no longer connected, you see that many of the menu selections are now grayed out. And that concludes this presentation. Thank you.